Welcome to Speaking of Higher Ed, Conversations on Teaching and Learning. I'm Andrew Everett. This podcast is produced by the Center for Instructional Innovation at Augusta University. We release new episodes the third Wednesday of each month in spring and fall semesters. Please take a moment to rate, review, subscribe, and share this podcast. This is episode 17. Our guests today are Drs. Candis Bond and Trent Kays. Dr. Bond is the director of the Center for Writing Excellence and an associate professor here at Augusta University. Dr. Kays is an assistant professor and director of college composition in Pamplin College here at Augusta University. My colleague Arthur Takahashi is here chatting with them about ungrading. Here's their conversation.
Dr. Bond, Dr. Kays, thank you so much for being here today, for being our guests. I'm very excited about today's topic, which is ungrading. But before we get to it, could you share with our listeners the path that brought you here to Augusta University? And Dr. Bond, we're going to start with you.
Okay. Well, thank you. So my name is Candis Bond, and I'm an associate professor of English in the Department of English and World Languages here in the Pamplin College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. And I'm also director of our Center for Writing Excellence. And I came to Augusta 8 years ago in 2016, so right after consolidation. And it was the offer that I took right out of graduate school. So I finished my dissertation at St. Louis University in fall of 2015, defended, was on the job market that year, and it led me here. It was a very competitive job market. So at the time, I didn't know a lot about Augusta University, but, came for my campus visit, loved the weather because it was January and it was 70 degrees, and then came to Augusta in fall of 2016.
All right. Dr. Kays?
My name is Trent Kays, assistant professor of English, director of college composition in the Department of English and World Languages. I'm also affiliated faculty in women's and gender studies as well. I came to Augusta, or I usually say I came to my next posting, as it were, right? My posting here at Augusta. I was previously at a small liberal arts school called Hampton-Sydney College, which has the distinction of being one of 3 remaining men's-only schools in the country, which is the thing I remember about that. And then before that, I was at Hampton University, which is a HBCU in Hampton, Virginia. And then before that, when I was working on my doctorate, I was at the University of Minnesota. And now here I am.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing your stories. So let's get to our topic for today, which is ungrading. And the first question that I have is, how would you explain the concept or philosophy of ungrading to faculty members who don't know what that is? And Dr. Kays, we can start with you.
Okay. So typically I think of ungrading as an assessment and evaluation approach or philosophy that kind of favors process more than anything. It favors kind of formative assessment, kind of learning in the process. It does not value traditional grading, that A through F scale, in any way. Matter of fact, it exists kind of specifically to go against it. And it tends to value really good verbal and written feedback more than a standard sort of percentage or grade or something of that nature.
All right. Dr. Bond, do you have anything to add or a different perspective?
No, I agree with everything that Trent said. I think it's a mindset. It's a philosophy. It's not necessarily a specific strategy or practice. There are lots of different, strategies and practices you can employ if you are operating within an ungrading framework, I guess. And in my mind, it just it helps you undistract students from having the emphasis on a grade. I think especially at Augusta University, we tend to recruit students who are very high achieving, who have very specific goals for what they want to do. And that means that sometimes they can be very grade focused. But within an ungrading framework, like Trent said, you're really kind of focusing more on intrinsic motivation. You're focusing more on the learning process and focusing less on extrinsic motivators and the letter grade.
Yeah, so that actually touches a little bit on my next question, which is whenever we try a different teaching approach or a different pedagogical approach in our courses, it's because we perhaps identified a problem, right? An instructional problem. Mm-hmm. So what is the instructional problem that led you to experiment with ungrading in your courses? And Dr. Bond, if you can start.
I'll start with a little story about myself as a kid, because I think that's where it all started, even though I had no idea then what ungrading was. But I was a kid who, my schooling was good, but I didn't really feel particularly challenged. And I think that made me a bit lazy. And I have a dad whose kind of top principle is self-discipline. And so he started to get frustrated with me when I was in first or second grade. He was always on me about, because I would say things like, "Oh, well, I got an A, it's fine," and he was getting frustrated that I wasn't living up to my potential. So he actually said, "We're going to make you do something that you're terrible at, and you're going to do it for a long time." So he said, "You have to pick a ball sport," which I am not coordinated or athletic anyway. So I picked softball, and he had this exercise where he would blindfold me on the pitching mound and tell me to try to get 100 strikes into a construction bucket that he had drilled a hole in the bottom of tied to the strike zone of the fence and the backstop. And I never had to get to 100 because that would be impossible for me. But he focused a lot on being in tune with my body and how it felt, and being able to do something without overthinking it, and really focusing kind of on the process of what it felt like to do that action. And really, so I ended up playing softball for years, never got very good, but learned a lot. And so I think that experience was really critical to how I just view education and learning, because it taught me that no matter your kind of natural ability, you can always do better, or you can learn new things. And sometimes that means that grades are not the best way, to assess your learning, that you can get good grades and it doesn't necessarily mean that's your top potential, or maybe you get bad grades and that doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have potential, or that you're not intelligent, or that you don't understand the material or can't do things with it. So then in grad school, when I started to study English, my degree is actually in literature, but I had a lot of faculty who were rhetoric and composition scholars, and took a lot of classes with them, and they really focused on, process models of teaching. It's why I ended up going more into writing rather than literature, because that I just enjoyed it and it resonated with me. And so I think that if you teach composition in particular, ungrading kind of is just already built into how you do things, because you are typically focused more on the process of learning and on skill building more so than you are on final products. And so that's kind of how I came to it. And I forget what your original question was. So
yeah, the instructional problem that led you to adopting and grading as a philosophy.
Yeah, so I wandered there. But I guess coming back to my original story, it was just this idea that sometimes grades don't give students the best sense of their capabilities, or what they could, what their potential is, or where they could focus their learning.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so this book that I have just completed reading, it's called Ungrading, Why Rating Students Undermines Learning and What to Do Instead. This is a book edited by Susan Blum, and has a lot of scholars sharing their instructional problems that they have encountered, and why they ended up choosing ungrading as their teaching philosophy. But one of the scholars really talks about how grades become sort of like the end goal for students, and it shouldn't be that way. So it kind of goes with a little bit of what you said, that students wouldn't focus so much on grades, but they will focus more on the process. But what about you, Dr. Kays?
When I was in K through 12 education, grades always came pretty easy for me, with the exception of math. And so I really never kind of understood what the whole point of grading was. But, when you're 16, your opinion really does not matter at all to the grading process in American education and higher education. How about that? And when I got to my master's program, I had a professor who gave me a book, and my master's program was the first time I ever taught. And unfortunately, like many master's programs who ask you to teach, they hand you a textbook and they say, go forth and teach. Ours was a little bit more structured, mine was, but I had an instructor that gave me a copy of Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. And if you want to talk about ungrading, yeah, he does a lot of ungrading. Basically, he says the entire grading structure, the entire educational structure is kind of wrong, and we need to recorrect it. And, that should not be the first book you read on pedagogy because it will alter how you see everything. You should read more sort of neutral books on pedagogy first, I tend to think now, to kind of get a broader understanding of what's going on, because critical pedagogy is definitely about taking grades, turning them on their head, right? Or just getting rid of them entirely and thinking about how we become capable in a topic. Not I got an A in it, but capable, right? Able to move forward with that, able to maybe even teach a little bit to others, right? Which I know for Frere would be like the ultimate kind of community action. And so as Candis already mentioned, in rhetoric and composition, we've been doing ungrading for a long time. We know that writing is a process, and we know that we should trust that process, and that process takes work, and we learn more from that process than we actually do from the product in many cases, because students will take what they learn in that process and they will take it to other situations. And that's really what we want. So typically, when I'm talking, especially to first year writing students, I try to tell them that what we're doing in composition is we're practicing. We're practicing genres. We're practicing the discourse, the rhetoric, the communication, right? Because they might come across those genres. They might have already come across them, right? So it's a good time to practice. And that's kind of how I got to ungrading. I usually don't use the term ungrading because it's just all revision to me, right? Just constant revision. So
let's switch to how you have implemented this philosophy into your own courses. You have touched a little bit on that because it's part of teaching English and literature. But if you can be a little bit more specific, how do you implement ungrading?
Well, one thing that I've done is I've started including a lot more credit, no credit assignments in my first year writing classes, where the goal is just to do something, right? And the process of doing something is about learning, right? So for example, this semester, we've been having a lot of conversations about using AI in first year writing. And I have had students, I've told students to use it for a specific assignment as a kind of reflective practice. And one of the things I asked them to do was to come up with some rules. What are the rules? What are the rules for our class? What are the rules? Come up with 5 guidelines for using AI in first year writing in a group, in a pairing. And they did. And the whole goal was to come up with these guidelines, to revise them so they work, to revise them so they can apply cross-generationally, which was a little extra I gave them. So somebody who is, say, 60, right? Can they read these guidelines and understand them the same way that somebody who's 16, right? And then they just turn it in, and whoever has the best one, we vote kind of as a class, they win a little prize. So it's not exactly grading in the same way, but there's a little kind of value there. It's nothing, it's hugely, it's candy usually, or as I brought in earlier, some oddly flavored to the American palate, at least, Japanese candy, right? Or Japanese Kit Kats. And I have found that they dig into that. They like to do something, to just do it and see it progress and know that I'm there and I want them to do this thing. That's it. We're just doing the activity to do it. That's it, right? And it's teaching us something. And I think a lot of students really enjoy that. Another way that it's not exactly ungrading, but another way I know many writing teachers work in what would be an ungrading philosophy is some writing teachers, myself included, have an open revision policy up until the last day of class. So if a student wants to revise their writing project 1, then they have up until the last day of class to submit that revision. It's not exactly ungrading, but it's basically my way of telling them that everybody in my class could theoretically get an A if you do the revision, right? And I want to hear what Candis has to say because I could talk forever. So,
yeah, well, I think those are all really great ideas. I'm going to think about like ways to do something similar with the AI thing next year. So I think early, I didn't use the term ungrading until quite recently. And even then, I never used it with my students. It was more just a way to signal to my supervisor in evaluations, like, I'm trying something new. But I think it started when I was in grad school learning how to teach composition for the first time. We were reading a book called Toward a Composition Made Whole by Jody Shipka at the time. And it's a book on multimodal composing. And she has this idea of the postmortem, which is just a reflection piece that you write, at the end of a project. And you can with ungrading, I do tell my students at the beginning, I don't talk with them about ungrading, but I do always tell them, I wish I didn't have to grade you. So in class, like, let's think about what it would look like if grades didn't exist. And let me show you all the ways I've tried to design the course to where we're not thinking about grades as much. Like, we do have that conversation, but we do a lot of process reflections for things that they compose. And those process reflections ask them questions about their intentions. And I try to definitely take intentions into account when I do finally assign a grade, whatever form that ends up taking. But, asking them like so actually Jody Shipka has a list of questions that I've just kind of modified over the years, but they focus on, what mode did you choose? What rhetorical decisions did you make and why? What did you intend to happen with this piece, for whom and in what context? And can you explain to me specific things that you did in the piece to try to make that happen? And then, was it successful in your opinion? What was it not? If it wasn't, what limitations or challenges emerge? Like really getting them to tell me the story of, this is what I was hoping to do. This is how I tried to do it. And this is what worked and didn't work. And really trying to assign a lot of, the effort or the points or the grade kind of towards that reflection more so than any product. And another thing I've always done is giving full credit for drafts. And, I tell them that the emphasis in the course is on revision. And this is no matter what class I teach, whether it's like a writing course or a lit course or women's exercise course or whatever it is. But, I'm more interested in your revision. So whatever you give me the first time, you're going to get the full amount of points, whatever it's worth. And then trying to make sure that that's at least half of the amount of the final grade for, whatever we're doing. And I know other faculty do things like they'll average drafts and final drafts, but I really like just giving them full credit because it really just shows them like, you can have a shitty first draft, to use like Anne Lamott's words, and I don't care because this is just our starting point. And then all of the work's kind of come after that and showing me what you want to make happen, and then we'll work to try to make that happen. So those are some of the things. Also, I found that, especially at a health sciences university, kind of putting the ball in their court in terms of what their goals are for our learning can really help with an ungrading philosophy or mindset. So I understand that my class might not always be their top priority, and I think that's okay. Like if you're not going on to be an English major or something, I don't expect you to necessarily think that this class is as much of a priority as maybe another class. But I do think that the skills we learn in the class are still essential and very helpful for you. So from day one, like, how can we brainstorm how this class is relevant to you, and like write that down for me so that I understand it, so we can kind of negotiate. And then, as we're doing all of the formative assessment throughout the semester, kind of holding them accountable for, this is what you said you wanted to learn or what you said you wanted to do. And this is how I and your peers are helping you get the feedback that you need to do that. And then reflecting, in those post-process, whatever reflections on, am I doing that? So kind of making the assessment more focused on their learning goals and less on, a grade of like an A or B or C. And they can pass the class. I tell them that too. I'm like, if you turn everything in, the points are structured to where you will at least get a C, even if you don't feel like it's your best work, or even if there's room to grow. Everybody should be able to pass this class if they just turn things in. But like check plus, I don't know if you do this, but like check plus, check minus, like kind of de-emphasizing percentages and grades, and just treating that helps them focus more on the feedback that you're giving them in writing or verbally and other things too.
Yeah, so just in hearing from both of you and diving a little bit into the literature of ungrading, some of the recurring themes that I hear in faculty trying to implement this philosophy in their courses. So those would include extensive feedback on the part of the instructor, helping students understand that process is more important than grades, value that process. But there's also a great degree of self-reflection, right, of metacognition. And, something else that I have seen is students grading themselves at the end of this metacognition or metacognitive activity. So do you give students the freedom to self-grade?
Well, it depends on the assignment, honestly, and the exercise. But I do everything I can to, once again, de-emphasize grading, even though I have to do it in class. However, I do ask students to sort of kind of vote, right, on what they think is the best. We do it as a class, right? Vote on a process that we think is the best, or if somebody did a revision that we think is the best one of the class, then we vote on that. We're like, yeah, that's the best one. We applaud a little bit. We really get into it, and it doesn't always work, of course, right? But and because I prefer that, I usually don't ask them to grade in that normal sense. I give them guidelines for peer review that are very structured. It's not graded, but it is highly structured because, in my experience, students need to be taught how to do peer review, and they need to be taught several times. Otherwise, they're not very good. They're not always the best at giving constructive feedback. They're good at giving feedback, just not always constructive feedback. So typically I have little kind of rules for me, basically, and this is how I go over it. I say, here are my rules. I'm the only one that corrects grammar. I'm the only one that corrects mechanics. I'm the only one that corrects syntax, unless it's so glaring, right? Because people take grammar correction very personally, right? So in that case, they are doing some self-evaluation in a way. But the parts where I think they'll be too self-critical, I sort of take those and I go ahead and take care of them. So,
yeah. What about you, Dr. Bond?
Yes, I have allowed students to self-assign their grades, more so in upper division courses. I've tried it a little bit in my freshman, sophomore courses, and they seem a little more resistant and nervous. And sometimes I think we just end up spending too much time dealing with their anxiety. So I've stopped doing that as much with the freshmen. But with my juniors and seniors, they really enjoy it. And by the time we get to the final draft, they've earned so much credit for the assignment already through peer review, the rough draft, any other low stakes assignments we've built in to scaffold it, that the final draft isn't a huge, chunk of the grade anyway. But I do sometimes ask them. And one assignment I did in my Writing Center Theory and Practice course in fall of 22 was I had them design a rhetorical reading guide, which is just a fancy term for they had to choose a genre they were unfamiliar with and a discipline they didn't know about. They had to find a faculty member in that discipline and ask if they could give them a model text, either a model text by a student who had given permission or a model text from a published journal or something like that. And then they had to interview the faculty member to ask them about the distinguishing features and just about writing in their field and how that faculty member learned to write in their discipline. And then they had to annotate this model text for an audience of students. So I was thinking we could use these in the Writing Center for students who come in, where they annotated it with what does it say, what's the rhetorical function of that, so what does it do, and then how does it orchestrate the reader's experience, so kind of 3 steps of annotation. And they got peer review on their draft of that annotated genre document, and then I gave them feedback on it. They got credit for all these steps, just as long as they did it, they got the full credit. And then the final draft they submitted, and I asked them to do a video where they talked for 5 minutes and just kind of went through some questions, and then said the last one was what grade would you give yourself? And interestingly, they always want to give themselves a lower grade than what I would have given them. They're very hard on themselves. So I usually, the times I did it with freshmen, but then when in this class of upperclassmen, I bumped up their grades to be higher in every case. But I thought they did a really good job of telling me about their process. I learned really valuable things in those videos about my assignment design and where it was challenging for them, and the fault was mine. It wasn't anything they were doing wrong. It was just I didn't design it well and I could fix it or do things better. And I also learned a lot about their intentions, and where maybe if I were just looking at it myself, I would think, this isn't really making sense. But then when they tell me what they did and why, and I see, I definitely see why you thought that would accomplish your goal. And then that really helps me be a more compassionate instructor and assessor, I guess, as well.
Yeah, this is actually one of the things that I find most fascinating when we ask students to do self-reflection on their assignments, is to actually find out that they're thinking about doing the right thing, but perhaps there's like a little misunderstanding that led them to something that is not entirely correct. And it makes me think about the assignment itself too. Am I explaining things right to students? So
absolutely. And I always give my students an example of me messing this up big time.
I love that.
Okay. So, and I tell them this is how a misunderstanding of a term or a concept can really go out of the way. And I tell them, okay, doctoral student, I'm writing my dissertation. And I say, before you do that, you have to take all of these exams that, basically wring your brain out. And I said, and on one of them, I was writing it and I misinterpreted something having to do with Aristotle. And of course, the examiner is an expert in Aristotle. And then he hands it to me back after I submit it. And I tell students, I said, I got 48 hours to write this. And that's it. And he hands it back and he says to me, did you mean to do this on page, I think it was like page 15 or whatever it was? And I was like, what are you talking about? He was like, well, you started this whole lengthy discussion of something and you're just wrong. It just is not going the right way. And I was like, oh. He was like, I think you probably want to take like 5 hours to redo it. And I'm like, okay. And then I took it back and I was like, I see what I did, right? And so it's like once you see what you've done, right, it becomes really much clearer. And the same happens with students. I'm like, okay, so, it's like, look what you did with this sentence. It's like, do you think an average reader will understand what happened? And I'm like, and not you, an average reader. And most of the time they'll be like, well, no. It's like, okay, well, let's try, And so this is one of the great things I think about like teaching writing, especially, is that back and forth kind of negotiated process of, okay, maybe you need to try this or maybe not. However, typically when it comes to quote unquote grading for me, the thing I tell my students is if you're happy with whatever you got, then you're happy with it. That's perfectly fine. I was like, if you're happy with that C, then you take control of that C, right? So not everything must be an A. However, if they want a A, whatever that is, I'm happy to try to give it to them if they do the work. Right. So,
and Dr. Kays, you mentioned something that I think is so important, which is showing students that we also make mistakes, and making mistakes is an essential part of learning. And one of the most convincing arguments that I found in the literature for adopting this ungrading philosophy and the criticism of the grading structure is that when you grade students, you are. And you end the process there. There's no chance for revisions or anything like that. You're basically cutting them off of this very important part of learning, which is making mistakes, but then building upon that. Have you seen that when you adopt this ungrading philosophy in your courses, that students are actually more willing and more first of all, they're more understanding that failing, making mistakes is okay, but more willing to revise that work for the sake of learning. Dr. Bond?
Absolutely. Yes, I think part of the ungrading philosophy, it's built on relationships too. Like it's dialogic. So I think students know, they learn pretty quickly they can trust you as long as you're upholding, your side of how you've structured the course and being transparent with them. They learn quickly you're on their side. You want them to grow. You're kind of like that warm demander figure in their life where, yes, you're asking them you're challenging their thinking, or maybe asking them to defend their choices or, revise. But it's because you want them to do well. It's because you do want them to grow and because you believe in them that they can do it. And for some students, I think that's a really new idea, like especially in writing, maybe also in math, I would imagine, because we have that weird binary where we're always told that we're bad at these things. But, like a lot of them really don't believe that they can be good writers or good at writing. And when you show them, like, none of us are really good at it, like, we just make it acceptable eventually through a lot of revision, then I think that's really eye-opening to them and encouraging. And then they will be motivated to put more effort into it.
Yeah, I think, like, for example, I regularly give students anonymized examples of my own writing. And I ask them, let's review and revise. I don't tell them it's mine, right?
Oh, I like that.
And I've done this with published academic articles all the way down to stuff that I hope never sees the light of day except for that classroom experience, right? Typically, first of all, students love doing these, I have found, doing these revision exercises where we're kind of going through and we're saying, how can we make this better? Does this make any sense? And usually after, when I tell students, okay, that was my writing, that was my paper, they're usually a little shocked. But occasionally I tell them, I'm like, see, I am also a bad writer, right? I can be a quote unquote bad writer, whatever that is, right? I said, the point is to Candis's great point, is that eventually we just stop. Eventually you just stop writing on that thing, whatever that document or project is. And whatever form it's in is the form it's in, and sometimes the stakes are really high and sometimes they're not. And I think, like, especially like with ungrading, with this concept of ungrading, or gentle grading, even, if you will, it's that, one, that the process never ends. You'll keep doing it, and it's okay to go in that process and do a good job and work and then be done. That's it. I think some students feel like if they don't learn every single writing skill right now, then they're doomed. And unfortunately, some of my colleagues also feel if students don't learn every writing activity in first year writing, they are also doomed. I meant that as a joke to my colleagues, but it is true, right? So there's a lot of pressure placed on rhetoric and writing and placed on those students to perform. And so I think, like, if we could be a space where they could come and practice and learn and feel a little less stress, just a little less, then I think that's a good thing. I think that's a good pedagogical strategy.
So another question that I have is, what if a student comes to you and says, I actually want to see a grade because that's how I track my progress. Feedback is great, but, a grade is what really tells me, how much more work I need to put into this course. So what would you tell that student, or how would you approach that question? Dr. Kays?
Well, typically I would give them a grade. So if a student comes up to me and asks me if, hey, I appreciate, what we're doing, but I really need to know, if I got a grade today, what would it be? Then I would sit down and look at all their work, and I would say, if I had to submit a final grade today, it probably would be this. What do you think about that? Right? And I always ask, what do you think about that? Because I want them to know that this is like not the end, right? This is a discussion. We can have a discussion about this grade. But I do recognize that, there are some students who, like, they need that grade, right? I need to know where I'm at. And to be completely fair, there were classes when I was an undergraduate where I was like that, right? I wanted to know, right? So I want to know if I have a 79 or 81, because that changes whether I'm going to get my scholarship or not, right? So things of that nature. And so in those cases, I'm perfectly amenable to giving a letter grade. I think the philosophy of ungrading is really about flexibility. So not every grading system will work for every student. So I think we've picked the one that works for the most students, even though we all complain about it, the A through F system, right? But it definitely does not work for every student. And so if a student really wanted a specific grade, I would be happy to give them that. And then I would also announce to every other student, if any student in here would like to meet with me privately to know if I had to give you a grade today, what it would be, we can do that. No problem.
Oh, I love that approach. Dr. Bond?
Yeah, so well, we do still have to submit grades to the university. So,
Yes.
at this stage, even if we've adopted this ungrading kind of structure, we still have to be keeping track ourselves some way. So I tend to still just use the LMS and whatever they're getting for things, it still is being entered. So I tend to use a point scale. So like even for things like drafts where I'm not giving them a grade, they get full credit if they turn it in, but I'm still putting in like whatever those points were. And usually I try to keep it at 1,000 points for the course. So it's easy for them to kind of know this is how many points I've earned so far. And then they can always check in D2L and see the updated total. And right before midterm, and right before ad drop, I do tend to have a conversation with them because we're usually doing conferences around those times anyway. So I'll say like, okay, so this is kind of where you're at right now. And similar to Trent, like, how do you feel about that? Do you feel like that's a fair representation? Do you have any questions? Is there anything you disagree with? And we kind of talk about it at those key points. So within the way that higher education still is right now, we still have grades and we're happy to share them with students.
Dr. Kays, I actually have a question for you, and we can blame Dr. Bond for that because we were brainstorming this podcast episode. I was asking Dr. Bond, do you know anybody else who adopts ungrading philosophy? And Dr. Bond said, well, Dr. Kays actually.
So she's why I'm here.
She is why you're here. But she said that you have a very interesting approach to grading, which is contract grading. Could you explain to the listeners what that is and how you implement that in your course?
Sure. So full disclosure, I'm not using contract grading this semester, but I have used it quite extensively in the past. And this semester, I'm kind of rethinking my grading strategies for the fall. But contract grading is definitely a method of grading. It definitely falls under that kind of ungrading approach. It really depends on who you talk to, of course. But contract grading basically lays it out as just that, a contract with deliverables. These are things that must be done to get X grade, right? So for example, that might be, you might factor in attendance in the contract grade. You might factor in what type of assignments a student will do. Sometimes, for example, I've done an assignment bank where a student could pick, so they have to pick 2 assignments from this category, 2 from this category, 3 exercises from that category. And if they do all of that, then they're guaranteed to get a C, right? If they do the next step, they're guaranteed to get a B, right? And one of the sort of great things about contract grading is that you kind of negotiate it with the student a little bit. So they know everything. You lay it out, right? You say, if you do these things, you will get a B, right? So if you don't do them, then you won't, right? There's really no like ambiguity in the same way where a student turns in their assignment and the instructor has it for 6 weeks and then they grade it and they return it, which for some topics that grading style works, but not every topic. And one of the people who does a lot of contract grading, or labor-based contract grading, is sort of the vogue term right now, would be like Asao Inoue, who is an anti-racist scholar in composition. And he's written several books on labor-based grading contracts as a way to increase equity and to ensure everybody has a voice in the classroom and that everybody's skill set is respected, right? So part of course taking a course is improving, right? But, that doesn't mean we have to sort of quote, knock where somebody's at already. We can say, okay, you're starting here. Good for you, right? Now we're going to work our way up, right? And so there are benefits to contract grading. There are downsides too. It takes a lot of time and effort and things that, just a lot of time and effort, and that's the biggest downside to them. So one of the ways I know some of my colleagues, and I have too, have tried to do this, is we've we've essentially taken elements of contract grading and we've just turned them into credit, no credit things, right? So we're taking basically, it's sort of like contract grading without the name, right? So how I have set it up is I have basically an understanding that if students do this amount of work, then in my mind, they deserve this type of grade. Of course, I evaluate their work and everything, right? That they have done good, right? And there's always a question about, okay, well, what happens if you have a student who attends every class, participates in every class, but only turns in, 2 of the 4 assignments, right? Well, that doesn't mean that student should necessarily fail. What it means is they didn't turn in 2 major assignments, but they did a whole bunch of extra work, right? So we shouldn't devalue that extra work, right? Because that kind of extra work is actually what it's like working outside the classroom, right? It's not always a major project. There are other little things along the way that contribute to it. And so that's kind of one way I think of contract grading, and I try to implement it. I hope to re-implement it in the fall, though I am only teaching online in the fall, and I haven't used contract grading with just online classes yet. Mm-hmm. And that might pose a different issue, or it could work out perfectly, right? This is the danger of teaching, right? So
experimentation,
right. Experimentation. Yeah. So, but that's sort of how I think of and approach contract grading.
So even with contract grading or Dr. Bond, your approach to ungrading your course, there's a lot of like student autonomy, right, built into your courses.
Yes. I mean, I know, Candis and I, our backgrounds in rhetoric, it definitely, you can't study rhetoric and not value student autonomy. I feel like in rhetoric, student autonomy is like one of the very first things that we talk about. We talk about student autonomy. We talk about student intellectual property, right? Things like that. And I am always concerned about student autonomy, especially with AI and things like that, or on the reverse side, faculty feeding things into AI detectors that aren't university sponsored, right? Just because it just seems like that would go against that student autonomy, But sorry, Candis, I get excited when we talk about student autonomy, right? I want to go into class and I want my student to teach me. And
that happens, right?
And that does happen sometimes. It does happen. Yeah.
A lot. No, I would say definitely it's all about student autonomy and promoting student agency, self-efficacy, letting them set the terms of, like I said, what they want to get out of their education, what they hope to learn. I think that it has to be student-centered to a large degree. Now, sometimes students do need help. I think one way so a lot of these strategies, I think that their goal is to promote equity and inclusivity and accessibility. But I do think that sometimes already marginalized students maybe don't have all the tools to articulate or even know the possibilities of what they might want to learn. Yeah. And so that's one place where I do think it's kind of on us as faculty to be able to know our students well enough to recognize when that might be the case and to have conversations with them about, here are some possibilities. And here's some of the politics surrounding those possibilities. Here's what you might be getting yourself into. Let's talk about that. And I know even in the Writing Center world, sometimes I joke, although it's not really a joke, but I ended up in writing centers because I really think that learning happens best one-to-one, because that's where these strategies, they really kind of come down to needing to really know who you're working with and have a relationship built on trust. And in writing centers, we don't have to grade. So people are so motivated because it's all on their terms and we're just there to kind of coach them through it, which, it takes a lot of pressure off of me as somebody that has to assess. But I feel like the students I work with in writing centers grow by leaps and bounds in a much shorter time than, in the classroom setting sometimes, just because we're already doing the ungrading structure is kind of already just there by the nature of it. But in the writing center, we used to have an appointment form, for example, that just had an open box of what do you want to work on today? And 95% of the time students would say grammar. And, we know that there are many other things you can work on in your writing besides grammar. And it wasn't so much that they wanted to focus on grammar. It's just they didn't know any other terms to put in there. So we changed it to be a checklist of just some kind of, common things that we see a lot, whether it's organization, transitions, citing or integrating sources, understanding the assignment prompt, making sure I met all their requirements. We have a list of about 10 to 15 things. And we have an other box too. So if it's none of those, they can check other and fill it in. But once we did that, then students started checking all kinds of things besides grammar. And so I think when you do these kinds of alternative assessment strategies, it is just something to be mindful of, that sometimes our students don't have the vocabulary to know what to ask for or what they want to do.
Yeah, so something that I have heard is that ungrading, just based on our conversation, that it helps with student learning, student motivation, and also with equity. Do you have any perhaps stories or a story that you could share on any of those fronts, how ungrading can help with equity, motivation, and or learning?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things with some of my students, for example, especially when it comes to like equity is I do believe giving them a lot of control to decide what they feel is the best approach and topic for something, with me being their sort of like guide, right? And there are some topics that I discourage because I feel that they're well worn. However, sometimes I'm wrong. And one semester I let a student run free, despite my guidelines suggesting, hey, for example, he wanted to write about a topic having to do with marijuana. Right. And so this is a very popular topic amongst 18 to 22-year-olds, right? I think the most popular topics amongst 18 to 22-year-olds, and of course, Candis can jump in here, would be gun rights, marijuana or drugs in general, parking on campus.
Interesting.
And maybe fairness in teaching, or their teachers not fair to them, maybe.
Don't forget, abortion is still a hot
Abortion.
one.
Oh, goodness. Abortion. Abortion or family planning, if we're going with the regular or the other term, I guess. But for example, one of my students, he did something on marijuana and he really ran with it. And he was like, I don't want to do this for my major assignment. I'm going to do this for one of our little research exercises. So I call these little exercises research or discussion exercises. So where either we won't meet, like if I have a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class, and we won't meet on a Friday, and I'll say, okay, this is one of our research days. Here's what you need to do. You need to go out and do X, right? Or it'll be a discussion day where they can contribute to an online discussion that's usually related to what we're talking about. Well, he did a thing on like marijuana and like how to make like fiber out of it and all sorts of stuff. He did not talk about its drug use once. He went out of his way to not talk about it. And of course, my original thought was, well, anyone who's going to write about marijuana and hemp and all that sort of stuff is going to write about the drug effects, because that's what most 18 to 22-year-olds write about. But he didn't. And as a result of that just little activity where he just got to do what he wanted, right? I learned something. We all learned something. And it was actually kind of really interesting. And as a result, I ended up going back and saying, okay, I'm going to take that off the, don't do list. But I'm going to say maybe don't focus on the drug part. Focus on the other stuff, right? Because most of the time when it comes to like ungrading or teaching writing or getting students to do or complete exercises, one of the things I try to tell them is that, a lot of topics are well worn, but maybe not to you, right? So like I've read probably 1,500 papers on, gun rights and how they need to be awesome in Columbia County or whatever, right? Or something like that. So I don't need to read another paper. I know every argument they're going to make, but the student doesn't, right? So I always try to remember that, and ungrading or employing some of those ungrading techniques has helped remind me of that. So.
Dr. Bond?
So I do think that some of the practices that go along with ungrading do create equity in the sense that you're not, your first response to things that students are turning in isn't punitive, and it's not like holding them to a universal standard, which I think is really dangerous. And Asao Inoue he's a good person to read if you want to,
Yes.
think more about the standardization of assessment in higher education. But I think that, for example, even something as simple as being pass-fail, like if you turn it in, you get the points, or like my rough drafts, you're getting the points and then we're going from there. It gives an opening for conversation and for negotiation where the student isn't backed into a corner having to defend themselves immediately, or thinking that, as you said earlier, like, this is it, I failed and I'm done. Like, and I know I've learned so much kind of about the rationale of why my students do things a certain way that wouldn't have been clear to me if I didn't just have that chance to ask them or give them opportunities to explain. And it's definitely shifted my thinking multiple times, even in terms of just like linguistic practices and, like things that don't make sense to me, or it wasn't the way that I grew up speaking or writing. But to this other person, they have a lot of, it's empowered them in the past. Like these ways of speaking and writing have been very rhetorically effective for them in their context. And so it's taught me to maybe take a step back and not just act on my first assumptions, and give them a chance to talk with me about it. And then we go from there, because it may be that, yeah, you're right. Like, let's keep doing it the way you're doing it. That makes sense. Or maybe it's an opportunity for me to share some of the things that like Asao Inoue talks about. And like, we do have political conversations or just ideological conversations, philosophical conversations about, expectations in college versus their own goals and how those things align or don't align.
All right, so let's take a quick break before we come back for our last question, which is the continuing the conversation question.
Got a teaching idea worth sharing? Share it on AU Teaching Commons. We are Augusta University's first peer-reviewed hub of open teaching resources by faculty for faculty. Share your knowledge, help your peers, impact students. Visit us at guides.augusta.edu/AU Teaching Commons.
All right, welcome back, everybody. So now we are going to move on to the continuing the conversation question, which is, what advice would you give other faculty members who are interested in implementing ungrading into their courses? So what would that be, Dr. Bond?
I would say just start small and test it out. So you don't have to redo your whole course the first time. Maybe just pick one assignment sequence or even just one activity, and see how you like it, and definitely adopt the ungrading mindset yourself, in the sense of, after you do that, get your students' feedback and ask them what they would improve, ask them how it helped them or didn't help them. And, then baby steps, you just kind of continue to expand it from there if you enjoy doing it.
Okay.
So I agree with everything Candis said. One thing I would say would be a good little intro into that way of thinking is to design an assignment with your students. Sit down and design an assignment for your class with your students. Start there. And then you can sort of see how they understand how they should be evaluated and how you understand they should be evaluated. And I think it would be really interesting, and I think it would be helpful to many faculty members to understand how their students understand it. And I tend to think that's a nice little entry down the corridor towards ungrading, because sometimes jumping in to the middle of it is way too much. We have, faculty are trained for a long time. It takes a little while to kind of unlearn certain assessment evaluation behaviors. So I would say start there. And then, of course, read. There's actually a lot of great texts that have come out in the last 3 years, especially, that are perfect. And I know I've already mentioned Asao Inoue, and then of course we have Susan Blum, which was already mentioned. She was already mentioned earlier. But there are lots and lots of people thinking about this topic and working through it and coming up with great exercises and assignments. And even if you don't adopt ungrading those are still great assignments and exercises to think through. So there's value there, even if you don't go full in to ungrading. There is definitely value there to any faculty member.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for this great conversation. I have enjoyed. I have learned a lot from you as well. But before we go, this is my last question. So what platforms can listeners connect with you on if they would like to continue the conversation with you? Dr. Kays?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn, Trent M. Kays. You can also find me on the university website, or you could email me if you want, tkays@augusta.edu. I'm happy to answer any question I'm capable of answering.
Dr. Bond?
All the same methods for me. Candis Bond on LinkedIn, or you can find me in the directory where my email is cbond, so cbond@augusta.edu.
Dr. Bond, Dr. Kays, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. And the conversation continues on our Facebook page at facebook.com/AUGCII. Please contribute your thoughts on today's topic and other episodes. You can find more on our show page at augusta.edu/innovation. And please take a moment to rate, review, subscribe, and share this podcast. So new episodes are available on the third Wednesday of each month in spring and fall semesters. Speaking of Higher Ed is produced by the Center for Instructional Innovation at Augusta University.